December 31st, 1941. Pearl Harbor still smells like burning oil. 8 battleships sit sunk or shattered in the mud. 2,400 American sailors are dead. And into that wreckage walks a quiet, silver-haired admiral from a small Texas town, a man almost nobody outside the Navy has heard of. His own staff will later say he never raised his voice, not once, not even when the news was catastrophic. 6 months later, this same man will stake the entire remaining strength of the United States Navy on a piece of paper covered in broken enemy code against the direct advice of Washington. He will be right. 3 years after that, he will order American forces to walk straight past the most heavily fortified Japanese base in the Pacific, leaving tens of thousands of enemy soldiers alive in his rear, and dare them to do something about it. Chester Nimitz never fired a shot in this war. He never needed to. What he did instead was quietly outthink an empire, one calculated risk at a time. These are his 3 most legendary moves, and the last one is the one almost nobody remembers, even though it may have won the war. December 31st, 1941. The harbor still stinks of burnt oil. Twisted steel breaks the surface of the water, where battleships once stood in tidy rows, now resting on the bottom in black mud, some of them still burning after 3 weeks. Sailors work in shifts around the clock, pulling bodies from compartments that have been sealed underwater since the 7th of December. The smell never really leaves. Men who serve here later say they can still taste it years afterward, whenever they think back to those first weeks. At night, the harbor glows faintly orange from fires that refuse to fully die, and the silence between explosions of salvage work feels heavier than the noise itself. Into this wreckage steps a man nobody in the fleet has met before. 56 years old, silver-haired, quiet-voiced, from a small town in the Texas Hill Country nobody in Hawaii has ever heard of. Chester Nimitz has just been handed command of what remains of the United States Pacific Fleet, and what remains is barely a fleet at all. 8 battleships sunk or crippled, the airfields cratered, over 2,400 men dead in less than 2 hours of attack. Washington has essentially told him to hold the line with wreckage and hope. When he steps off the submarine that carries him into Pearl Harbor, the officers waiting on the dock expect to see something like panic in his face, or at least grim resignation. What they see instead is a man studying the wrecks quietly, almost clinically, the way a physician studies a patient before deciding whether the patient can still be saved. One aide who accompanied him that first morning later recalled that Nimitz asked more questions about which repair yards and dry docks had survived intact than about the scale of the disaster itself, already thinking, within hours of arriving, about what could still be rebuilt rather than what had been lost. He does not raise his voice. That is the detail every officer who served under him repeats, decades later, in oral histories and memoirs. Nimitz absorbs bad news the way a stone absorbs rain, without visible reaction, and then asks quiet, precise questions until he understands exactly what happened and exactly what can be done about it. He does not look for someone to blame. He looks for what is still usable. Men who work closely with him describe a habit he never broke throughout the entire war. Before making any major decision, he would listen to every officer in the room, including the most junior ones, and only speak last, after he had heard every argument that could possibly be made against his own instinct. And in the ruins of Pearl Harbor, he finds something the Japanese never expected him to have. A basement. Beneath the Naval Headquarters building, in a windowless room crammed with code tables and coffee cups, a small unit called Station Hypo works around the clock under a brilliant, disheveled commander named Joseph Rochefort, a man who sometimes wears a smoking jacket to work because he never goes home. The room smells of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, the walls covered in scraps of intercepted Japanese naval traffic, thousands of 5-digit number groups that mean nothing to the untrained eye, and everything to the men who have spent months learning to read the patterns hidden inside them. Rochefort and his team have spent over a year chipping away at the Japanese naval code known as JN-25, and by the spring of 1942, they are starting to read fragments of it. Not everything, just enough, sometimes, to catch a piece of a sentence that changes the entire war. Nimitz visits the basement personally, more than any other fleet commander before him ever had, and makes a decision that will define the coming battle. He will trust these tired, overworked codebreakers over the polished reports coming out of Washington. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan appears unstoppable. Her carrier force, the WWII, has burned across half the globe, striking Pearl Harbor, sinking the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya, raiding as far as Ceylon in the Indian Ocean. The architect behind most of it, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, wants one final, decisive battle to finish what Pearl Harbor started: the total destruction of the American carrier fleet. His target is a tiny atoll at the far northwestern tip of the Hawaiian chain called Midway. Take Midway, and the Americans will have no choice but to send their remaining carriers to defend it. Once they do, Yamamoto's overwhelming force will crush them for good, and Japan will hold a defensive perimeter so vast that any American attempt to claw it back would cost more blood than the American public could ever be asked to bear. The entire plan depends on one assumption: that the Americans have no idea he is coming. Rochefort's team picks up fragments of Japanese naval traffic referring to an operation against a target labeled only as AF. Rochefort is almost certain AF means Midway. Washington disagrees. Naval intelligence in the capital insists the real target is somewhere in the South Pacific, or possibly even the American West Coast, and argues that committing everything to defend a speck of coral sand would be reckless. It is, in effect, one man's judgment against an entire intelligence bureaucracy, and the argument grows heated enough that officers on both sides begin sending increasingly sharp messages back and forth across the Pacific. Rochefort proposes a quiet trick. Midway's garrison is ordered to send an uncoded radio message complaining that its saltwater distillation plant has broken down and that the base is running short of fresh drinking water. Days later, Station Hypo intercepts a Japanese message reporting that AF is short of water. The proof is now undeniable. Nimitz listens to the argument from Washington, listens to Rochefort, and makes his decision. He backs the basement over the bureaucracy. The target is Midway. The attack will come in the first days of June. It is a decision that, if wrong, could cost the United States every carrier it has left in the Pacific. What Nimitz now possesses is the one thing Yamamoto never imagined the Americans could have: time. The numbers are still brutal. Yamamoto is bringing 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, and dozens of supporting warships. Nimitz can put exactly 3 carriers into the water: the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown. And the Yorktown should not even be seaworthy. She limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier, with her flight deck cratered and her hull torn open, black smoke still leaking from compartments below the waterline, damage that Japanese intelligence assumes will keep her out of the war for months. Nimitz walks the dry dock himself, in his khaki uniform, looks at the raw wound in her hull, and gives the repair crews an order that seems almost impossible. 72 hours. Over 1,400 workers swarm the ship in round-the-clock shifts, welding torches throwing sparks through the night air, generators screaming, men sleeping in short snatches on the dock itself rather than walk home and lose an hour of work. 72 hours later, Yorktown steams out of Pearl Harbor, still carrying repair crews on board, men welding bulkheads below decks as she heads toward battle, the smell of scorched metal still clinging to her passageways. Yamamoto believes this ship does not exist anymore. He is about to learn otherwise. Nimitz positions his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, tucked into open ocean the Japanese have no reason to search, a spot the American sailors nickname Point Luck. Then he waits, back in Pearl Harbor, unable to do anything more than trust the plan he has set in motion and the men now carrying it forward without him. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft roar off their flight decks and strike Midway exactly as Rochefort predicted, down to the day. For a moment, everything appears to be going Yamamoto's way, but American torpedo squadrons, flying slow, obsolete aircraft with almost no fighter escort, find the Japanese carriers first and attack alone, skimming just above the waves directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Nearly the entire squadron from the Hornet is shot out of the sky. Only one man survives, floating alone in an empty life raft for over a day, watching the battle he cannot affect unfold around him. It looks, in the moment, like a catastrophic and pointless sacrifice. It is not pointless. The low, slow torpedo planes have dragged every Japanese fighter down to wave top height to hunt them, stripping away the carrier's air cover at the exact moment their flight decks are crowded with fuel lines and bombs being swapped from one type to another. High above, completely unopposed, American dive bombers led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey arrive at the one moment in the entire war when Japan's carriers are most vulnerable and least protected, their decks packed with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance with nowhere to go. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, are transformed into floating infernos, secondary explosions tearing through their hangar decks one after another. The 4th, the Hiryu, launches a furious counterstrike that afternoon and manages to cripple the newly repaired Yorktown, but American dive bombers find her only hours later and leave her burning as well. She is struck and set ablaze that afternoon and scuttled by her own crew the following morning, June 5th. All 4 carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now rest on the floor of the Pacific, along with more than 100 of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who cannot simply be replaced by training new pilots in a few months. Midway is the hinge point of the entire Pacific War, and it was not won with more ships, more steel, or more guns. The Americans were outnumbered in almost every category that mattered. It was won because one admiral, standing in the wreckage of Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, chose to trust the men in a windowless basement over the doubts of Washington, and turned out to be exactly right. It was a pattern of judgment he would rely on again, more than once, before the war in the Pacific was finally over. By the summer of 1943, the shock of Midway had faded into a colder, more difficult problem. Japan no longer held the initiative in the Pacific, but Japan still held the map. Hundreds of islands and atolls stretched between the American fleet and the Japanese home islands, many of them turned into fortresses over the preceding decades, garrisoned by soldiers who had already shown, again and again, that they would fight to the last man rather than surrender. A war fought island by island in strict sequence, reducing every single fortified position before advancing to the next one, would take years. It would grind through the best years of an entire generation of American men, and there was no guarantee the country's will to keep paying that price would survive to see the end of it. Maps pinned to the walls of Pearl Harbor's planning rooms showed the problem starkly. An ocean the size of a continent, scattered with thousands of tiny points of land, many of them worthless strips of coral and sand, others hiding airfields and harbors that could shelter entire fleets. Somewhere among all of it lay a path to Tokyo, and no one yet knew exactly which islands on the map actually mattered and which could simply be left alone. Nimitz understood this arithmetic better than almost anyone in Washington, because he was the one who had to look at the casualty reports first. In November of 1943, American Marines stormed a small, heavily fortified island called Betio in the Tarawa Atoll, a strip of coral barely the size of a small town. The Japanese garrison had built their defenses with brutal thoroughness, concrete bunkers and interlocking machine gun nests that had survived days of naval bombardment almost untouched, and the assault turned into 76 hours of the most concentrated killing the Marine Corps had ever experienced. Landing craft grounded on a reef the planners had misjudged, forcing men to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, dragging rifles over their heads while the man beside them dropped and did not get back up. Correspondents who came ashore afterward described a beach so thick with the dead that it was difficult to walk without stepping on a body. By the time the island was secured, more than 1,000 Marines were dead, and over 2,000 more were wounded, all for a piece of ground smaller than most American farms, a coral airstrip that would be used for barely more than a year before the war moved past it entirely. Photographs from the beach eventually reached American newspapers and magazines back home, images of dead Marines lying half-submerged in the surf where they had fallen. And for many ordinary Americans, it was the first time the true cost of the island war had been shown to them in such unflinching detail. The public reaction was immediate and furious, letters pouring into congressional offices demanding to know why so many young men had died for a single small island most Americans had never heard of before that week. Nimitz read those reactions too, understanding that the political tolerance for repeating Tarawa's arithmetic again and again, island after island, all the way to Japan, was not infinite. Whatever strategy came next would have to answer that question as much as it answered the military one. Tarawa was a victory. It was also a warning. If every Japanese-held island in the Pacific had to be taken this way, at this cost, the war might stretch into the late 1940s, and the United States might simply run out of young men willing to storm the next beach. Nimitz absorbed the casualty figures the way he absorbed every piece of bad news, without visible emotion, though officers close to him said privately that Tarawa weighed on him more heavily than almost any other single event of the war. He read every after-action report personally and quietly began building a different kind of war, one that would refuse to repeat that arithmetic wherever it could possibly be avoided. The idea itself was almost embarrassingly simple to describe, even though almost nobody in either navy had built an entire campaign around it before. Rather than attacking every Japanese position in sequence, American forces would identify the handful of islands that actually mattered, the ones that offered airfields or anchorages essential to the advance, strike those, and simply go around everything else. A fortified Japanese garrison, cut off from resupply by American air and naval power, was not really a threat to anyone anymore. It was a mouth to feed with no food left to feed it. Some officers in the planning staff argued against the idea at first, uneasy at the thought of leaving tens of thousands of armed Japanese troops alive and unconquered in the fleet's rear, a decision that ran against decades of conventional military instinct built on the assumption that any enemy force left standing had to eventually be destroyed. Nimitz listened patiently to the objections, weighed them carefully against the alternative, and pressed forward anyway. Historians studying the campaign afterward would describe the doctrine in a phrase that stuck, that bypassed Japanese garrisons were simply left to wither on the vine, starved of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcement, reduced to islands full of hungry, isolated men who could no longer influence the war in any direction. The logic also solved a second problem that rarely made it into official reports. Every fortified island captured directly required an occupying garrison of its own to hold afterward engineers, supply depots, anti-aircraft batteries, all of it pulling men and material away from the advance toward Japan. An island left to wither on the vine required nothing at all, not even a single American soldier standing guard, because starvation and isolation did the work that an invasion force would otherwise have to do at gunpoint. The most dramatic proof of the idea came in February of 1944, at a Japanese base so heavily fortified that American planners had nicknamed it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Truk Atoll, deep in the Caroline Islands, was the anchor of the entire Japanese defensive position in the Central Pacific, home to a natural lagoon large enough to shelter the bulk of the Imperial Japanese fleet, ringed by airfields and coastal guns, and thought by many American planners to be nearly impregnable. Early planning studies assumed that any advance toward Japan would require capturing Truk directly, an operation that promised casualties on a scale that made Tarawa look small by comparison, an assumption that had quietly terrified planning staffs in Pearl Harbor for the better part of a year. Nimitz chose a different path entirely. In what became known as Operation Hailstone, American carrier aircraft descended on Truk over 2 days in February 1944, wave after wave crossing the lagoon at dawn, while Japanese ships still lay at anchor, caught almost entirely by surprise. The strike devastated Truk's air power and shipping, sinking dozens of vessels and destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground, turning the harbor's still morning water into a field of burning oil slicks and wreckage by the second day. Then, having broken its teeth, the American fleet simply sailed past it. Truk, still garrisoned by tens of thousands of Japanese troops, was never invaded. It sat for the remainder of the war, cut off, starving, and irrelevant, its once feared harbor turning into a graveyard of half-sunken freighters that fishermen would still be pointing out decades later. The same logic was applied up and down the Pacific. The powerful Japanese base at Rabaul, another fortress originally expected to require a bloody direct assault, was instead pounded from the air for months and left isolated, along with the smaller base at Kavieng, while American forces struck instead at Tarawa's sister positions in the Marshalls, then at Saipan, Guam, and eventually Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the positions that genuinely stood between the fleet and the Japanese home islands. The Japanese had built a wall meant to bleed the Americans white at every single point of contact. Nimitz, with cold and patient calculation, simply chose which points of contact would happen and refused all the others. Japanese officers on Truk and Rabaul, interviewed years later after the war's end, described the strange, demoralizing experience of waiting month after month for an invasion that never came, watching American ships pass within sight of their coastline on the way to attack somewhere else entirely, understanding only gradually that they had already been written out of the war without ever firing a shot in its final chapters. Island hopping shortened the Pacific War by at least a year and saved, by later estimates, hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides that a purely sequential campaign would have consumed. It required something genuinely rare in military command: the confidence to leave tens of thousands of armed enemy soldiers alive and in place behind your own advancing lines, and trust that the logic holding them in check was sound enough to make them harmless. Not every officer in the Pacific Fleet was comfortable with that kind of exposure, and some argued privately that leaving so many armed Japanese troops intact was an unnecessary gamble that could still backfire if circumstances changed. Nimitz was comfortable with it, and he carried that discomfort quietly, the same way he carried every other difficult decision of the war. While the island campaign unfolded on the surface of the ocean, a second war was being fought beneath it, one that received almost no headlines at the time and remains, even now, one of the least discussed campaigns of the entire war, despite arguably doing more to defeat Japan than any single surface battle. Japan in 1941 was a nation almost entirely dependent on imported resources to fight a modern war. She had virtually no domestic oil production of her own, limited iron ore, and a food supply that could not simultaneously feed her civilian population and fuel her military industry without imports. Everything that kept the Japanese war machine running, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore and coal from occupied China, rice and other foodstuffs from Southeast Asia, had to cross thousands of miles of open ocean in slow, lightly defended merchant ships. Cut those supply lines, and Japan would not need to be defeated in a single decisive battle. She would simply starve, slowly, from the inside, unable to fuel her ships, arm her factories, or feed her soldiers, let alone her civilian population back home. It was a vulnerability almost entirely invisible on a map of battle lines and troop positions, the kind of weakness that showed up only in shipping manifests, fuel tank readings, and the quiet arithmetic of tonnage loaded and tonnage lost, numbers that meant nothing to newspaper readers back home, but meant everything to the men actually running Japan's war machine. Nimitz grasped this early, and made the American submarine force a central strategic priority rather than a supporting one. It did not begin well. Throughout 1942 and much of 1943, American submarine crews took enormous risks, creeping in close, under cover of darkness, lining up perfect shots on Japanese ships, only to watch their torpedoes run too deep beneath the target's hull, or slam into the side of an enemy ship with an audible thud and fail to explode at all. Captains surfaced afterward and radioed furious, disbelieving reports of clean hits that had produced nothing but a dull clang against steel. The Mark 14 torpedo, rushed into service years earlier, suffered from a defective magnetic firing mechanism and a depth control flaw that had never been properly tested under peacetime budget constraints, and the bureau responsible for the weapon spent months denying that anything was wrong at all, effectively accusing its own submarine captains of poor marksmanship rather than admit the weapon itself was broken. For the men actually riding the submarines out on patrol, the frustration went beyond paperwork. Crews who had spent weeks stalking a target through hostile waters, risking depth charges and aircraft to reach firing position, watched their torpedoes strike home and simply fail to detonate, over and over, an experience one submarine officer later described as being handed a rifle loaded with blanks and told to go hunting. Some boats went entire patrols without a single confirmed sinking despite firing dozens of torpedoes, returning to port exhausted, furious, and empty-handed while the war moved on without them. Nimitz's submarine force commander, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, pushed furiously for live fire testing to prove the flaw, at one point ordering torpedoes fired into a fishing net to physically inspect their running depth, evidence blunt enough that Washington could no longer explain it away. Nimitz backed him completely, cutting through the institutional denial and forcing the fixes through by mid-1943. Once the torpedoes actually worked, and once Nimitz filled his submarine command billets with younger, more aggressive captains willing to press attacks at close and dangerous range, rather than the cautious, by-the-book tactics of the war's early months, the campaign turned from a frustrating embarrassment into the most efficient killing machine in the Pacific War. The numbers, once tallied after the war, were staggering. American submarines, a service that made up less than 2% of naval personnel, sank more than 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels and warships, totaling over 5 million tons of shipping, a rate of destruction no other branch of the Pacific War came close to matching relative to its size. By 1944, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies slowed to a trickle. Japanese warships sat at anchor, unable to conduct full training exercises because there was no fuel to spare for practice, their newest pilots arriving in the fleet with a fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts had logged. Aircraft sat grounded on airfields for want of aviation gasoline. Factories that had once run around the clock idled for lack of raw material. It was a form of strangulation almost invisible to the public, fought entirely out of sight, by men sealed inside steel hulls for weeks at a time, breathing recycled air thick with the smell of diesel and unwashed bodies, listening in silence while depth charges exploded close enough to crack light bulbs and rattle teeth in men's skulls, gauges shattering, cork insulation raining down from the overhead in the darkness. Few submarine captains embodied both the danger and the aggression of the campaign more than Commander Richard O'Kane, who had served as executive officer under one of the war's most aggressive early submarine skippers before taking command of his own boat, the USS Tang, in 1944. Over the course of just 5 patrols, O'Kane pressed attacks at ranges other captains considered suicidal, surfacing in the middle of enemy convoys at night to fire at point-blank range before diving away into the darkness. And by the time of his final patrol, he had been credited with sinking more enemy tonnage than any other American submarine commander of the entire war. On the night of October 24, 1944, in the middle of the Formosa Strait, Tang fired her final torpedo of a devastating night attack on a Japanese convoy, only for the torpedo to malfunction, curve in a wide circle, and strike the submarine that had just fired it. A nightmare every submariner in the Pacific quietly feared, but rarely spoke of aloud. Tang sank within minutes. O'Kane and a handful of his crew survived in the freezing water, some clinging to wreckage through the night, and were later pulled from the sea by the very Japanese ships they had been attacking hours earlier, spending the rest of the war as prisoners under brutal conditions. He would receive the Medal of Honor for that final patrol, a single, brutal reminder that even in the campaign's most successful year, the ocean gave no guarantees to anyone, American or Japanese. Beyond the raw tonnage figures, the submarine force performed a second function that rarely receives public attention. Positioned along the approaches to Japanese-held waters, American submarines served as the fleet's eyes, feeding Nimitz real-time intelligence on enemy fleet movements that shaped some of the largest surface engagements of the war. In June of 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, submarines spotted the approaching Japanese carrier force well before American aircraft made contact, radioing sighting reports back through the darkness. And two submarines, the Albacore and the Kavala, each put a torpedo into a Japanese fleet carrier before the surface battle had even truly begun, contributing to a lopsided American victory that decimated what remained of Japan's carrier aviation in a single afternoon of fighting American pilots, later nicknamed the Marianas Turkey Shoot. 4 months later, at the opening of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, two American submarines, the Darter and the Dace, lying in ambush in the Palawan Passage in the dark hours before dawn, struck first against the approaching Japanese battle fleet, sinking one heavy cruiser serving as the enemy fleet commander's flagship, sinking a second cruiser alongside it, and damaging a third badly enough to force it to turn back, crippling Japanese naval power and command before the main surface action had even started. In both battles, the pattern was the same. Long before any admiral on the surface fleet spotted an enemy mast on the horizon, a submarine captain crouched over a periscope in near total silence had already found the enemy first, and the intelligence racing back to Pearl Harbor by radio often shaped the entire American response before a single surface ship had fired a shot. It was a form of warfare built almost entirely on patience and nerve, hours spent motionless at periscope depth while an enemy destroyer passed close enough overhead that the crew could hear its screws churning through the hull, followed by a single brief burst of violence, and then the long, silent retreat back into deep water to wait again. Submarines also carried out one of the quieter, less celebrated forms of service in the entire Pacific War. Stationed near enemy-held islands during major carrier strikes, as part of what pilots came to call the lifeguard patrols, they pulled hundreds of downed American aviators out of the water, often from within sight of Japanese-controlled shorelines and under the threat of enemy shore batteries, saving experienced pilots whose training and skill could not simply be replaced with a few months at flight school. One young torpedo bomber pilot, shot down over a small Japanese-held island in September 1944, spent hours adrift in a small yellow life raft, alone on the open ocean, before a waiting American submarine surfaced nearby and pulled him from the water. That pilot, a young lieutenant named George Bush, would later become the President of the United States, one small, almost incidental thread among the hundreds of lives quietly saved beneath the surface of a war being fought, for the most part, in total silence and total darkness. By the middle of 1945, before a single atomic bomb had ever been dropped on Japan, the country's war economy was already collapsing under the combined weight of the island campaign and the submarine blockade. Her oil reserves were nearly exhausted. Her once feared navy could barely put to sea for lack of fuel. Her merchant marine, the lifeline connecting the home islands to every resource needed to keep fighting, had been reduced to a shattered remnant. Rusting hulks and burned-out wrecks scattered across shipping lanes that had once carried the wealth of an empire. Two campaigns, one fought in plain sight across 1,000 miles of island chains, the other fought in total silence beneath the waves, had together done something that no single decisive battle ever could. They had begun to starve an empire to death, quietly, patiently, and almost entirely out of view. Neither campaign carried the drama of a single afternoon like Midway, no 5-minute turning point that historians could point to and call decisive. Instead, month after month, island after island, ship after ship, they had worn the Japanese Empire down to something hollow, so that by the time the final act of the war arrived, The outcome was in many ways already decided beneath the surface, long before anyone in Tokyo was willing to admit it out loud. By the summer of 1945, the war that had begun in the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor was closing in on Japan from every direction at once, and Chester Nimitz was no longer merely commanding the Pacific Fleet, he was commanding the most powerful naval force ever assembled in human history. In December of 1944, months before the war's final chapter had even begun, he had been promoted to Fleet Admiral, the highest rank the United States Navy had ever created, a 5-star rank shared by only 3 other men in the entire war. It was a quiet recognition of something that had already become obvious to everyone around him. The man who had walked into the wreckage of Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier, with almost nothing left to command, now controlled more ships, more aircraft, and more firepower than any admiral in the history of naval warfare. The final months of the war were also its costliest. At Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, Japanese resistance reached a level of desperation the Pacific War had not seen before. Waves of kamikaze aircraft crashing deliberately into American ships. Pilots choosing certain death rather than surrender. A grim preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves might cost. It was against this backdrop, of an enemy growing more fanatical even as its material strength collapsed, that the twin campaigns Nimitz had built over the previous 3 years finally reached their breaking point. Japan's navy could barely put to sea. Her air force, though still capable of suicidal, devastating attacks in small numbers, could no longer contest the sky in any organized way. Her cities sat almost defenseless against strategic bombing, her factories starved of the raw materials that submarines had spent 2 years cutting off at their source. The fighting at Okinawa alone claimed the lives of more than 12,000 American servicemen and well over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, a single battle more costly in American lives than the entire island campaign that had preceded it, fought over a piece of ground barely larger than a mid-sized American county. Ships offshore endured weeks of kamikaze attacks that sank or damaged dozens of vessels, sailors watching aircraft deliberately dive into the decks beneath their feet in numbers no earlier campaign in the Pacific had ever produced. For Nimitz, reading these casualty reports in Pearl Harbor, the arithmetic of Tarawa had returned, multiplied many times over, and it hardened his conviction that whatever ended the war needed to end it as quickly as the available options allowed. In August of 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and within days the Japanese government signaled its intention to surrender. Historians still argue, and will likely always argue, about the precise weight each factor carried in that final decision: the atomic bombs, the Soviet declaration of war, or the slow economic strangulation that had already left Japan unable to fight a modern war in any sustained way. What is not in dispute is the condition Japan was in by that point. A nation that had once commanded the most feared carrier force in the world could no longer fuel its remaining ships. A nation that had built an empire stretching across a third of the globe could no longer feed all of its own people. The war had not simply been lost on a single battlefield. It had been lost, piece by piece, across 3 years of decisions made in a windowless basement, across 1,000 miles of bypassed islands, and beneath the surface of an ocean that had swallowed entire convoys without a trace. On the 2nd of September 1945, Chester Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, in the same quiet, deliberate manner that had defined every decision of his command, and signed the instrument of Japan's formal surrender on behalf of the United States. Japanese officials in formal dress stood across the table, the harbor around them crowded with American warships that would have seemed like an impossible fantasy to the men standing in the wreckage of Pearl Harbor less than 4 years earlier. There was no dramatic speech, no raised voice, nothing that resembled the theatrical flair that other commanders of the war had made their trademark. Nimitz simply signed his name, in the same steady hand that had signed orders sending 3 carriers into an ambush at Midway, orders bypassing the most heavily fortified base in the Pacific, and orders pushing a struggling submarine force through years of institutional denial until it finally worked exactly as intended. Sailors and officers crowded every available rail and gun mount of the surrounding ships to watch, straining for a glimpse of the small table where the surrender documents lay. And correspondents present that morning described an almost eerie stillness over the harbor, broken only by the occasional distant drone of aircraft flying overhead in formation as a show of continued strength. It was by every account a strangely quiet end to a war that had begun with the sky over Pearl Harbor full of smoke and burning aircraft less than 4 years earlier. He went on to serve as Chief of Naval Operations, the Navy's highest administrative post, guiding the service through its difficult transition from the largest fighting force in its history back toward a smaller peacetime footing. He testified before Congress, oversaw the demobilization of a Navy that at its peak had numbered more ships than every other Navy on Earth combined, and handled the bureaucratic aftermath of total victory with the same unhurried, methodical patience he had brought to the darkest days of 1942. He never sought the public spotlight, the way some of his fellow commanders did. He gave few dramatic interviews, wrote no memoir filled with score settling against rivals, and eventually retired to a quiet home on the California coast, where neighbors would later describe a mild-mannered, silver-haired old man who spent his afternoons gardening and rarely spoke unprompted about the war he had helped win. Visitors who met him in those later years often came away surprised at how ordinary he seemed in person, a courteous, soft-spoken man who preferred to ask questions about his guests rather than dwell on his own record, the same instinct for listening before speaking that had defined his entire wartime command. When journalists occasionally pressed him for a dramatic story or a moment of personal glory, he tended to redirect credit toward the codebreakers, the submarine crews, and the pilots who had actually carried out the decisions he had made from behind a desk, insisting that the war had been won by thousands of men whose names history would never bother to record. What made Chester Nimitz remarkable was never a single spectacular gesture. It was the accumulation of 3 decisions, each one resting on the same underlying habit of mind. At Midway, he trusted the judgment of tired codebreakers, working in a basement over the confident assurances of Washington, and staked nearly the entire remaining American carrier fleet on being right. In the island campaigns that followed, he trusted a strategy that ran against decades of military instinct, leaving tens of thousands of armed enemy soldiers alive in his rear, rather than spend American lives destroying garrisons that no longer mattered. And in the long, invisible submarine campaign beneath the surface of the Pacific, he trusted a badly flawed weapon and the men willing to fix it, even as an entire bureaucracy in Washington insisted the problem lay elsewhere. None of these decisions offered the kind of certainty that makes for comfortable command. Each one required Nimitz to act on incomplete information, against institutional resistance, with the entire war in the Pacific hanging on the outcome. Each time, he weighed the evidence in front of him with the same quiet, unhurried calm, and each time, he was right. It is worth remembering that being right was never guaranteed. Rochefort could have been wrong about Midway, and the entire Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers could have sailed into an empty patch of ocean while Yamamoto struck somewhere else entirely. The bypass strategy could have collapsed if the isolated Japanese garrisons had somehow found a way to strike back at the fleet's exposed rear. The submarine force could have remained broken indefinitely if Lockwood's fight against the Torpedo Bureau had failed. Nimitz's legacy rests not on the certainty of these outcomes, which no one could have guaranteed in advance, but on the discipline of his judgment, under conditions where being wrong could have cost thousands of lives and years of additional war. Historians who have studied the Pacific War for decades continue to debate which of the great commanders deserves to be remembered as the single most important figure in America's victory over Japan. Douglas MacArthur commanded the spotlight. William Halsey commanded the newspapers. But it was Chester Nimitz, working without theatrics from an office in Pearl Harbor, who commanded the actual machinery of the war, the intelligence that found the enemy fleet before it struck, the strategy that decided which islands were worth American lives and which were not, and the submarine force that slowly starved an empire of the fuel and material it needed to keep fighting at all. He was not the loudest man in the Pacific War. He may well have been the most indispensable, the one commander whose removal from the chain of events at almost any point between December 1941 and September 1945 might plausibly have changed the outcome, or at least the cost of getting there. Chester Nimitz never fired a shot in anger during the entire Second World War. He never needed to. What he did instead, patiently and methodically, in the same calm and unhurried tone he brought to every decision of the war, was help take apart an empire piece by piece, decision by decision, until there was nothing left of it for anyone to fight with. Thank you for watching. Which of Chester Nimitz's 3 legendary moves do you think mattered most to the final outcome of the Pacific War? And which other legendary commander should we cover next? If you found this story useful, please consider subscribing. See you again very soon.